tanks. I do research and do a bit of facilitation on policy processes and how policy can be influenced. And I'm also interested in how people work together to produce things of shared value within that context. Today's webinar is called Leadership Practice. Is there such a thing, and what could we usefully say about it? The webinar will be presented by Professor Chris Mowles, who is the director of the Doctor of Management program at the UK's University of Hertfordshire Business School. And he's also the leader of the university's Managing Complex Change Research team. So, Chris will start talking in just a few moments. And while he's talking, please do write your questions or comments in the chat box. And during his talk, he will look at those comments and questions and try to address those or incorporate those points or issues into what he's saying in real time. So do engage on the chat box whilst he's talking. But whilst he's talking, please do keep your microphones muted, just so that we can pay attention to what he's saying. So I think that's all for now. Chris, can I ask you to take it from here?
Yeah, okay. So thanks very much for inviting me to talk. And I hope that you will have had a chance to look at the two pieces of reading that were sent out before this talk, because it might help to contextualize a bit what I'm going to say. So the first thing to say is that the program I run at the University of Hertfordshire draws on a 20-year tradition of thinking about analogies from the complexity sciences and how they might be taken up in an organizational context. Now, why is that important for thinking about leadership? Well, I suppose one of the central insights from the complexity sciences, as I understand them, is that whatever happens in organizations happens simply and only because of what everybody is doing together. Now, that might seem like a very simple, even a simplistic insight, but I think it's a profound one because it offers a very different model for thinking about how change happens in organizations, how authority is exercised, what we might mean by getting things done together. Because I would argue, and I'm going to make a simplistic argument here, that most of what one might read about leadership or management, or what one might learn in many organizational leadership development courses, it puts an enormous stress on the individual capabilities of leaders. So right at the simple end of that, then we're encouraged to believe that leaders have some kind of unique insight into the human condition, that they have visions, that they can transform things because of their charismatic appeal. So I think the central insight that we take from the complexity sciences at the University of Hertfordshire, that whatever happens, happens because what everybody is doing together decenters the leader and the individual leader's capabilities from any understanding of what leadership is or what it might be or how it might be helpful to think about it. Now, that might be relieving to people and it might be disappointing. So I think there is something quite exciting about the charismatic leadership discourse where leaders are unique individuals with special powers. And I must say that in contemporary organizations, leaders get fantastic rewards as well for being leaders. So it might also be disappointing to hear that it's not just about the individual. It might also be relieving if one thinks that that is a huge burden, particularly if the routine everyday practice of leadership, whatever we might mean by it, is actually fairly mundane. And there is quite a lot of scholarship on the mundane activities of leaders, despite the inflated discourse about what leaders are or what they do. So if we pursue this central insight that whatever happens, happens because of what everybody is doing, that the leader and the people they are leading are all caught up in a game together, then this implies a radical decentering of what the leader does. And it also implies that there's no privileged position outside of organizational life where the leader can stand with some kind of God's eye view and dictate what happens, or even to know really what is happening in an organization, because they're caught up in the game of organizational life along with everybody else. So I'm coming at this by thinking that, first of all, leaders are highly influential people in groups. So I'm certainly not making the case that we don't lead leaders, or that they're unimportant, or they're not influential. But what I am trying to point to is they're caught up in the game of organizational life along with everybody else. And that means that they're in charge, but probably not in control. Again, I want to stress, I'm not saying that they can't be highly influential, and they may have a very good way of influencing what people do, how they're rewarded, how they're punished, where they sit, what kind of work that they apply themselves to. Leaders can have a very profound influence in that way. But they don't get to dictate, and the further away staff are from the main leader or the senior management team, the less influence that they have on day-to-day organizational life. So if you like, what leaders are doing are trying to influence, sometimes at a great distance. So in organizations such as international development organizations, which are distributed across many countries, there is a huge limit on what leaders can do and what they can achieve, particularly because the game of organizational life might be taking place somewhere else entirely, in a completely different context. So one of my motivations for talking to you today really is to deflate some of the more grandiose claims about what leadership is and what it can achieve, and kind of the powers of leaders to influence organizational life. There's so what is it that leaders do? So if the dominant discourse on leadership tends to prioritize the charismatic appeals, the appeals to the big words like passion and transformation and change, what is it that they might be doing on the day-to-day? And I think you'll see some clues for that, certainly in the report that I wrote with colleagues on transformational change in the UK higher education sector. So what became clear, we talked to nearly 50 respondents in 6 universities in the UK who were given the task of undertaking some kind of transformational change. And it transpired that a lot of what they do is actually quite mundane and is the day-to-day politics of organizational life. So it's simply walking about the organization, talking to people, encouraging people, recognizing people, helping people reframe things, sometimes in quite mundane ways, and participating in clearing away blockages for people so that they can get their work done, or helping them to reframe what they're doing in a way that is more helpful to them in their everyday organizational life. So I think it's important to decenter leadership, to make it more mundane and everyday, to make it more practical in order to engage with it, particularly in terms of the organizations that you participate in, particularly in the highly political activity of think tanks, where I guess you're producing policy papers in order to influence other people. So influencing other people is not a predictable undertaking. It's something that's probabilistic. You might succeed and you might not, and you might become more skillful at influencing people, but there are certainly no guarantees. So in probabilistic undertakings, like international development, like influencing in terms of policy, I think a different set of skills are required and a different focus is required, rather than assuming that change is predictable, or that even that leaders have a say in how things might turn out. So what kind of skills might leaders be exercising where, if they do consider themselves as part of an ongoing game of organizational life, of being highly influential, but not necessarily being in the most privileged position? Well, one of the things I think that they're doing is they are storytellers in chief. So I think that requires an ability to understand organizational narratives and people stories, and somehow to retell them in ways in which people see themselves reflected. And I like to think that President Obama, particularly in his first presidential election campaign, was particularly good at doing that, of taking something about American history, retelling the stories that everybody knows, but retelling them in a way in which large numbers of people can see themselves reflected. I am always reluctant to choose examples where world leaders are involved. I always think that when I talk to groups about leadership, it's always going to be about 5 or 10 minutes until somebody starts talking about Steve Jobs or Richard Branson or Gandhi or something like that. But the point of choosing President Obama is, one, he was particularly good as a storyteller and reframing people's traditional understandings of how they understood themselves and what their identity was. But also he wasn't convincing for everybody. So for some groups of people in the United States, he called out the opposite of what he intended. And you might point to the success of Obama's 2 presidencies of calling out the opposite in the days of President Trump, which you could see as a reaction to President Obama's particular skill in storytelling. So one of the things I suppose the example of President Obama does is to give us an example of change and counter-change, of action and reaction, that no leader is so transformational or so inspirational that they aren't going to call out a variety of different responses in different groups within an organization or within a country. So I think that leads me to the second insight about what leaders, the kinds of skills that leaders need, or the kind of work that they might get involved in, is that I think leaders are often subject to enormous projections on the part of the people that they lead, and often provoke very strong feelings in people. So the second thing that leaders are involved in when they're telling stories about what's going on and where they're trying to make meaning with people about what's happening in organizational life, is the meaning that they make and their participation in organizational life will provoke very strong feelings in people, both positive and negative. So one of the things that leaders require then, in order to do their work well, is to be able to endure these feelings and to try and make sense of them, and even to anticipate them, if you like. And that leads me to the third area that I would say leaders or people in influential positions in organizational life need to develop, and that's the skill of accepting that you're part of a group and being able to read more skillfully what the group requires in order to move on. And one of the clues to that then is the profound feelings as being part of a group provokes in you as the influential person, as you as the authority person. So it's not just about dealing with other people's feelings, it's also about dealing with your own. And being able to be a connoisseur of your own feelings. So I would argue that in ordinary, everyday management discourse, feelings are something that regarded as unprofessional, or perhaps something to be kept out of the workplace. But I think it's, for me, it's a requirement really in order to be able to work in a group well, to be able to have an understanding of what people in the group might be feeling and what you feel about what the people in the group are feeling. In other words, it's another source of data for thinking about how to play the organizational game together and how to make meaning. The next thing that I think leaders require, or influential people require in organizations, is an understanding that we are interdependent. So the moment we accept that we are interdependent, it immediately implies a power relationship between us. So we need each other to get things done. Particularly if we accept that the old days of command and control are gone, and there has been an erosion of traditional sources of authority, if you like, even within the family. So an enhanced ability to think about power relationships between people and the power that one has formally or informally in groups, I would say is crucial to understanding how to function well in groups and how to exercise authority in groups, and even to accept that not all power questions, not all questions of interdependence in organizations are to do with leadership. For example, leadership isn't always exercised by the formal leaders in organizational life or in groups. And I guess we can all think of examples where that's the case. Sometimes it's the most junior person in the group who, temporarily at least, would be thought to be exercising leadership or to take some role of authority in the group. So group skills, political skills, the ability to endure one's own feelings and be more skillful in recognizing them, the ability to recognize other people's strong feelings towards you, which might be positive and might be negative, points to another quality, which I guess is the ability to endure uncertainty. So the moment you leave the rational model where leaders are in charge and can predict the future, which I would say simplistically is a governing assumption in much leadership development work and much educational management. If you were to think that the future is probabilistic, it will probably turn out much as we predict, but there will be all kinds of unintended consequences as well. There will be times in organizational life, particularly in very turbulent environments, where we don't know what's going to happen, and people will be looking to the authority figure for some kind of certainty, or even to express uncertainty. So the ability to endure that uncertainty longer than the group that one participates in, and not to have to close it down, or sometimes to close it down because certainty is what is required of you, is the kind of practical judgment that leaders also need to develop if they're going to make sense of participating in a group where they have a particularly influential position. So I'm just going to read, yes, okay, so somebody said, how do you talk about feelings in the workplace in a context where you're likely to be told to go and see a therapist? Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I would say that there is something of a thawing of the ability to talk about feelings in the workplace. Certainly in the UK, and it may be very different if you're not in the UK, but certainly there's a much greater acceptance that it's partly under the banner of well-being. So because circumstances in organizational life are often quite harsh, there's been a much greater emphasis on well-being and looking after yourself. Sometimes I think this can reinforce individualism in organizations, as if poor working conditions then become the responsibility of the individual to sort out for themselves. But I think that it has at least created more possibility for talking about feelings of uncertainty, feelings of stress, even the ability to recognize that we don't always know what's going to happen. And I noticed that even in my own organization in a business school, where there's a huge emphasis on metrics and measuring things and quantification. Nonetheless, there is also at the same time an acceptance that no matter how good the plans are, no matter how much we try and control through quantification, all kinds of things happen in organizational life of which we're not in control. And sometimes it's okay to acknowledge that. So I can only talk from a European and UK experience, and I'd be interested to know how far that's also the case beyond the UK and Europe. But I would say the discourse about feelings and being able to admit to them in professional space has got much easier than it used to be. It's not just something that will get you a bad reputation. In fact, it can sometimes be very powerful in bringing a group of people into a better relationship with themselves and what's going on for them. So is it true that a leader is often alone, is unable to take some important decisions? Well, I hope what I've been saying is, if you think of leadership as a group activity, it's something that takes place in a group, and whatever leadership is, it's created by what everybody is doing together. And I think you could argue that a leader is never alone, even if they feel that they're alone. So I suppose one of the things to do if you are in a leadership position is to think about how you are with others, co-creating whatever is happening in your organization and whatever is happening in your group, which is not to argue that you're all co-responsible for what's happening. Obviously, if you have authority invested in you, you have particular responsibilities, usually greater than everybody else's, to get something done or to make an interpretation or to take a decision. But you can only do so if the people you're leading or the people over whom you have authority agree or accept or cooperate with you in the exercise of your authority. Because as you all know, there are lots of ways of blocking people in authority. There are lots of ways of subverting plans. There are lots of ways of gaming what the organization requires of you. So to a degree, you're always going to need the active or passive cooperation of the people that you're working with. The days where you could simply command people to do things is over, but that's not to say that some organizations aren't very intimidating places where it is relatively difficult to talk in public about what's going on, and where it's often important to at least publicly appear to conform, even if privately people are gossiping in corridors or in the car park. Most people in leadership positions do not cultivate the skills you've mentioned. Do you think that's the case? Yes, I would say that probably is the case, and that's because many organizations jump into leadership development and leadership training without thinking critically about what we mean by leadership. and without thinking about what the exercise of authority and power in organizations might involve, and therefore where to pay attention. So I think a lot of the models of leadership are developed principally in American business schools. And then they are exported as though they are applicable everywhere the same, and as if they were even working in the American context from which they derive. So there's a separate political discussion to be had, I think, about why the individualistic narrative about leadership is so dominant and which groups it serves. So if you had a theory of discourse that ideologies become dominant because they serve the interests of particular groups, then you'd have to ask yourself which groups have their interests served by this current discourse on leadership. And certainly leaders themselves are doing very well out of this current discourse, and so are business schools. I get asked frequently to talk about leadership and leaders, so I certainly make my living out of it, so I'm no different, you could say. But I think, again, certainly in the UK context, there are a number of leadership development courses which do pay more attention to the kinds of skills that I'm talking about: the ability to reflect, the ability to become reflexive, the ability to notice group life and to pay attention to it, and to think of oneself as participating in a group. I would say it's a substantial but minority discipline in leadership development studies to think alternatively about leadership, partly because we've had 30 years of leadership discourse and we still get crap leaders. So if the leadership discourse is so good, how is it that leadership in organizations hasn't improved? There must be something wrong. I mean, certainly if you look at the UK political context, maybe we get the leaders that we deserve, but there wouldn't be any obvious evidence that the political leaders that we get, all the leaders that we get in organizations, are particularly serving us well, with more than 30 years of constant refinement of what leadership is. And I mean, there are so many different manifestations of leadership: servant leadership, distributed leadership, transformational leadership, you name it. There's a school of thought on leadership, and yet still the quality of leadership in organization is quite poor. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're finding it useful. So it would be helpful for me to know a bit about the organizational context that you're working in, and to know whether any of the points that I made are particularly relevant to your organizations, or what you think I'm saying is so far beyond what's useful to you that you can't engage with it. Okay, so the work I did in South Sudan was with a colleague on the faculty of the Doctor of Management at the University of Hertfordshire, and with the local South Sudanese director of an NGO there called Windle Trust International. So the idea was, particularly in the South Sudanese context, there are big difficulties about how to exercise authority, both in organizational life and in the broader polity more generally. So again, you don't have very many good examples of the productive and generative use of power to get things done. So it's I've already spoken about the fact that there's an enormous amount of money available for leadership development, even though we can't agree on what good leadership is, or at least we can only agree what good leadership is in the abstract. We know what good leadership is when we don't get it, but we can't describe in a very predictable way how to train leaders to get the kind of leadership that we need. So we were able to get a grant from Open Society to go to South Sudan to talk to people who were mostly middle managers. There weren't very many senior leaders, but mostly middle managers. to help them think about some of the questions that we're talking about today. So, is every exercise of power in organization to do with leadership? What other games are people caught up in? How do they think about their own participation in organizational life? So it's very easy to think that problems in organizational life are to do with what other people are doing, rather than thinking as well about how one is participating oneself in the patterns that are created in organizational life. So it was reflective space over 3 weekends in Juba with a group of people, some of whom stayed the same, some of whom came and went, to get them to think in a more complex way, in a more subtle way, about some of those questions that I was talking about. So how to live with contradictions, for example, where the organizational plan says we'll do one thing, but actually we find ourselves doing something else. We want to include this group in our plans, but actually that by doing so, we've excluded some other group. The kind of practical judgment that you need to develop, where we as human beings keep repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again, but sometimes find it difficult to concentrate on that as a breakdown, or even to notice it and to think about it in a different way. The ability to put difficult questions into words and to think about them, the ability to express feelings about what's going on. So we worked with a group of people over the course of a year. We went there 3 times. We had about 7 days together, seven or 8 days together. And I think people found it a very productive way of spending the time, although there has been no opportunity to go back to see whether those different ways of working, group-based, politics-based, power-based, feelings-based ways of working, reflection-based. We've got no idea really whether the things that people found productive have continued to be productive for them, or whether it needs constantly updating and constantly sustaining. So I would say it is possible to enhance one's skill as a practitioner in groups. It's not just something you're born with. So we are all social animals. We're social through and through. So we can only survive by being in groups, but actually the skills that we use in groups are not always explicit to us. So I suppose what we spent a year doing in South Sudan was to make some of those skills that people are already using more explicit to them, so that they have a better sense of mobilizing them more consciously. What kinds of leadership development are you doing in your organizations, or is this something that you don't do? Is not something that you've investigated in depth? Okay, right. Okay. I wonder whether it's worth thinking about storytelling in organizations, because I would guess that's something that takes place in all organizations. So all organizations tell stories about themselves, about what they're trying to achieve, and most stories in organizations involve who we are and what we care about. Yeah, so leadership is much more than the management team. So narrative, I think, is very important in organizational life, and it's certainly important for a leader to get their head around, or a senior management team to get their head around about. So one of my colleagues I used to work with used to say that when people are doing strategy, they're basically asking themselves two questions. Who are we and what do we think we're doing? And if you can answer those questions well, then if you like, that is the strategy. The strategy writes itself. So people spend quite a lot of time predicting the future or creating some kind of an ideal to which they aspire and then count back in logical steps from there. And all of that is very important work. But actually in doing so, the two questions that they're answering at the same time is this identity question, who are we? And the who are we question is very explicit in organizations. And that's something that one notices when one goes into an organization as a consultant or as a new employee. So people often catch you up in stories about who we are. And there's a kind of a disciplining process, I guess, if you're an outside consultant or a new employee, where you're taught the important stories of the new group that you're joining, and you're invited one way or another to participate in those stories, initially to accept them, and then gradually, I think, to question those stories and to have your own role in renewing the story or even changing the story. And I would say that senior management teams have a particular role in this, and leaders too, in retelling the story. So stories can't be changed entirely, but retelling the story in a way which fits new circumstances and ways in which people can see themselves reflected. And one of the difficulties of organizational change is sometimes, perhaps usually, retelling the story about who we are and what we are doing or what we need to do. Sometimes people don't feel themselves recognized in that story, and then either there needs to be a change to the story or the people have to leave. So I think it's that question of recognition, recognizing yourself or not recognizing yourself in the story, that contributes to a sense of belonging and contributes or doesn't contribute to a sense of coherence in organizational life. So in telling the story, I guess one of the things that you're doing is meaning making, and dwelling on one of the other qualities that I was talking about in leaders is not only are you storyteller in chief, but you're also meaning maker in chief. Although it would be important not to see yourself as the only source of meaning making, but also being a provoker of other people to make meaning. And sometimes to adapt yourself to the idea that other people can sometimes make better meaning than you can. So I think it's very important in the exercise of power in organizational life to accept sometimes that you're wrong, or that there are counter positions to what you're setting out. And that shouldn't necessarily delay you in making a decision, but the acknowledgement that yours is not the only position, that there are multiple narratives in organizations, and not all of them emanate from the senior management team or for the leader, I think is a very important aspect of creating an environment where people can see themselves and what they're doing reflected and valued. I must say, thinking about this group, so I've just talked about the importance of having an enhanced ability to read what's going on in a group and to be able to respond to it. I must say that being part of this webinar, it's particularly difficult to know who you are, what you want from the seminar, what you're thinking about what I'm saying. I'm just talking into a void. So I guess in this environment, you might think of me as a temporary leader. So I've been invested with a particular authority to talk to you and to engage you in something. And you can see how technology helps the ability to talk to you at a distance, but doesn't help in terms of my being able to read what's required from you by responding to your needs. So I suppose this is quite a good example of thinking about what I'm talking about, where I have no idea what you're thinking or feeling. I can't see you and I have very little feedback from you. So, Annapurna, I'm guessing that already, in order to get things done in organizational life in India, you're already doing what I'm describing. So people are already cooperating to get things done. So the danger of presenting what I'm presenting is it sounds as though I'm suggesting something new rather than simply describing what you're already doing with your colleagues to get things done. So you have to respond to them, you have to take note of their feelings, you are telling each other stories, you are trying to persuade each other to do it this way rather than that way. You are exercising practical judgment and political judgment already. Yeah, exactly. So I'm merely trying to put into words what you're already doing as a way of valuing that, rather than thinking that leadership is something other than what you're already doing. So as I said at the very beginning, one of my intentions with this webinar is to deflate the discourse on leadership as if leadership was something special. What I'm trying to say about leadership is actually it's very practical and down to earth, and probably what you're already doing. And if you become aware of it, it may be that you can do it a bit more, and maybe you can do it a bit more skillfully. Yeah. So I don't think I'm bringing anything particularly revelatory or new. I'm basically saying that it's everyday negotiation with a particular ability to realize that that's what you're doing, to be reflective and reflexive. I'm sure you're all very good at what you're doing. Otherwise you wouldn't be doing it. Any other thoughts before we close? Well, I wish you all the best, and if you want to think some more, you're welcome to write to me. There's quite a bit of material on thinking about this. I've given you 2 articles to read, but there are a number of other people who write about the social and group-based aspects of leadership, which are less than individualized, which might be useful for you as a reading list if you're thinking of doing some more study on this. Okay. Are we finished, Ajay?
Yep. So we do have a comment from John, but
yep.
I guess we do you want to have a quick read of that, Chris, and see if you want to address that?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. there's a kind of implicit in some assumption about this. So I don't disagree that sometimes the people closest to the work need to make the decisions, and sometimes hierarchies work against that. But I wouldn't be of the opinion that hierarchy is necessarily a bad thing. So there's plenty of literature to say that actually hierarchies are still the most effective way of running an organization, depending on the size of the organization, of course. So I think it's relatively fashionable to think that somehow we can get away with hierarchy and top-down control. But actually, one might think of it as the least worst option in a way. So some of the fashionable new developments like sociocracy and holocracy might simply be replacing an informal hierarchy with a formal hierarchy with an informal one. So yeah, it'd be interesting to think more carefully about that and to work it through. Great. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Chris.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Been very helpful, very informative. Just so that you know, we have been recording this webinar, and we'll send you a copy. We'll send you a link to the video shortly after this, and hopefully other people will be able to tune in to listen to what you have to say and engage online. So thanks to Chris, and thanks everyone for zooming in. Have a good day.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, actually.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.